Hello and welcome to a webinar hosted by Physicians Association for Nutrition Israel. We're a part of an international organization of health professionals aiming to reduce diet-related diseases, improve lives, and rethink health. One of the ways we do that is by joining hands and staying up to date in evidence-based knowledge on how to prevent and treat disease by healthy lifestyle and especially healthy nutrition. My name is Roni, I'm a dietitian and I lead Pan Israel. And I'm very excited and honored to host Dr. David Katz for a conversation that will take us from the foundations of nutrition science to the current controversies in the field, and finally to a hot topic that simply cannot be ignored, the new US Dietary Guidelines, the DGA, and their impact on both human health and planetary health. Dr. Katz is a leading authority in preventing and lifestyle medicine. He's a specialist in internal medicine, preventive medicine, public health, integrative medicine, and lifestyle medicine, with particular expertise in nutrition. Dr. Katz is the founder and former director of Yale University's Yale Griffin Prevention Research Center. He's a past president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, founder of the nonprofit True Health Initiative, and founder and CEO of Diet ID. We'll have time for a short Q&A towards the end of the session. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Katz. So, let's dive right in. תודה.
תודה רבה. שלום, כולם, ערב טוב. מאוד נעים לי להיות איתכם היום. עכשיו אני חושב שזה רעיון טוב לדבר אנגלית, before I embarrass myself.
Thank you so much, and let's dive right in. In the world of nutrition science, where do we find a clear scientific consensus, the common ground, and where does significant controversy still persist? More importantly, what is our responsibility as health professionals when navigating these areas?
All right, and as we agreed, Roni, I'm going to show some slides.
Sure.
And divide those up in response to the questions that you asked me. So on the issue of common ground, I have strong feelings. I've spent nearly 4 decades now in the nutrition public health space, and I'm privileged to call many of the world's leading experts my personal friends. Some are attending right now, but I've met a great diversity of experts. And we've broken bread together. That's an expression. Breaking bread it refers to having meals together, but it really also just refers to coming together. And for the vegans in the group, we can talk about splitting peas as well. But what we've done is attended conferences all around the world. And we have spent several days together, and that means we've had meals together. And I've seen what different experts eat when it's mealtime. And so I have colleagues who've devoted their careers to the Mediterranean diet, and colleagues who are ardent vegans, and colleagues who've studied and published on the paleo diet, and on it goes. And the interesting thing to me was that when it came time for a meal, all of these diverse nutrition experts, who often seem to disagree quite emphatically with one another, ate far more alike than different. So just if we pick the two extremes, a paleo diet and a vegan diet, if you're at a conference together and you have some choices, what you find is the real experts in the paleo diet have a plate full of greens and vegetables, and then wild salmon, or if it's offered, maybe bison. But mostly it's a big plate of vegetables, plant foods. And the vegans have the same big plate of plant foods, and instead of having wild salmon, they have lentils or beans. But you look at those two plates and they're much more alike than different. And what always struck me is that they were vastly different, both from the typical American diet. And I thought the typical American, or the typical Israeli for that matter, wouldn't know that these experts are so much more like one another than they seem. Because if you ask somebody who advocates for the paleo diet, which diet is best, that's what they'll tell you. And similarly for vegan or Mediterranean. So I tested a hypothesis. This was about 15 years ago. I thought, I wonder if I can call upon leading experts in the nutrition public health space who seem to disagree with one another and get them to actually say in public, we agree. I'm not going to agree if I am a vegan that the paleo diet is best, but I will agree that a diet that is made up of real food, mostly plants, is best. So I created this set of principles and asked colleague after colleague, would you be willing to say in public that we agree and that we stand on common ground? And before too long, I had 100 and then 200 and then several hundred and ultimately about 500 experts from 50 countries with expertise and interests ranging from paleo to vegan and everything in between, saying we do in fact agree. So one of the obligations, Honey, for professionals is to look past the superficial differences that so distract the public and to recognize the commonalities among ourselves. When you ask an expert her or his opinion, what we tend to talk about is the thing we do that makes us special, the thing we do that makes us different. So we tend to amplify our differences. I would say one of our professional obligations is to represent the commonalities, to represent the common ground. The differences can be important too, but if we're 95% in agreement and 5% different, all we ever tend to talk about is the 5%. Let's acknowledge the 95%. So this is the mission of the True Health Initiative. So this nonprofit I created, that's where we have these 500 experts, 50 countries. You can go to truehealthinitiative.org and see all these different people who are saying, we agree about the fundamentals of food and lifestyle as medicine. But the exercise actually began with a conference that was literally dedicated to the common ground. So in 2015 in Boston, I was privileged to co-chair a conference with Walter Willett, sponsored by Old Ways. And the whole point was, can we elucidate the common ground for health promoting nutrition among experts and authorities who seem to disagree? And so Old Ways made a particular effort to invite people who had interests in the beef industry and the dairy industry and all the different diets. And each of us had an opportunity to present our point of view. And then in between sessions in a back room, I was the master of ceremonies, and it was my job to work out where we agreed. And at the end of this conference, we published a consensus statement showing that across this incredible divide of interests and expertise and affiliations, we did in fact agree. And that really was the basis for the True Health Initiative. But there was a problem. And this is another area on your question about, what are our obligations as leaders in the field, as professionals? Where do those fall? So we gave this conference to a room full of influencers, so dietitians, other health professionals, experts. Many of them were journalists and bloggers, because we wanted them to amplify this message that there was a lot of common ground. And a very insightful dietitian and writer in the room, Monica Reinigal, some of you may know Monica, was present when we announced with considerable fanfare that we had achieved a consensus statement. We were posting it online. And by the way, you can go to the Old Ways website and the URL I showed on the previous slide, and you can find all these materials to this day. But she immediately went up to Dean Ornish, whose name I suspect is familiar to many of you, and asked Dr. Ornish, okay, so you just had this conference, you all just announced that you agree, but let me ask you, what diet do you think is best for health? And Dr. Ornish characterized his diet, the low-fat, plant-based Ornish diet, just like you'd expect him to. And then Monica immediately crossed the room and went to Dr. Frank Hugh, who's the current chair of nutrition at Harvard, and asked Frank, okay, Dr. Hugh, what do you think is the best diet? And Frank has spent his career studying the Mediterranean diet, so he characterized why the Mediterranean diet was best for health. I had gone up to my hotel room to celebrate the fact that we achieved the consensus. We found the common ground. Basically, my wife and I were opening the bottle of champagne when Monica called me on my cell phone and said, not so fast. You just announced this consensus. I just asked two of the experts who spoke at your conference what diet was best, and they gave me completely different answers. So I asked her, what was your question? And she told me. I asked each one which diet is best. I said, well, there's the problem. It's not so much the answers. Obviously, someone who's devoted their whole career to studying diet A or diet B is going to have very strong reasons why they like diet A or diet B. But what you need to ask them is, what are the fundamental principles of an optimal diet for human health? Because that answer would be nearly identical. They would line up with 95% of the response, and then they would differ. And the version of that I prefer is version A, and the version of that I prefer is version B. So Ronnie, there's another obligation we have. We have to recognize that the value of an answer is partly stipulated by the caliber of the question. We often ask the wrong question and box in an answer, so it really can't reveal the whole truth. The answer may be true. Dean Ornish really likes his diet best. Frank Hugh really likes the Mediterranean diet best. But that's not the whole truth. The whole truth is they eat much more like one another than either eats like the typical American or Israeli or people around the world. And they agree much, much more than they disagree. And that fact often gets lost. Okay, I think that's probably enough on that issue of common ground. I'll pause there.
Right. So thank you so much. And this brings me to the next question, because you were talking about asking the right questions. So you often discuss the limitations of the traditional hierarchy of evidence in our field. Could you elaborate on why a heavy reliance on RCTs, randomized controlled trials, might actually be a barrier to understanding long-term nutritional health?
Absolutely. And part of my response to that is that very issue, that so much of the value of any given answer resides in the question. So I'll come back to that issue. But RCTs are designed to answer a question. If it's a bad question, it doesn't really matter that the tool is good. So RCTs are powerful. They're very good tools. I would note, and by the way, just to be clear, so that my qualifications to opine on RCTs are in play here. I've conducted many and published many. So I've conducted dozens of RCTs in my career and published them, and conducted and published meta-analyses and systematic reviews. So and written textbooks on evidence-based medicine. So well steeped in these methods. So I respect them. I appreciate them. I use them. And of course I read them, but they're not by any means a perfect arbiter of truth. So the rhyme and reason of RCTs is that they involve randomization, blinding, and placebo control. Randomization is a defense against confounders. And I'm going to assume everybody has familiarity with the scientific lingo surrounding research methods. But the real value in randomization is not so much a defense against bias, although it defends against select biases. But its principal value is it's a defense against confounders, both known and unknown. If you take a large population and randomly allocate to two different groups or multiple groups, you're likely to achieve a relative balance among factors, even that you know nothing about. So for example, if there are specific genetic mutations you're not aware of that are potentially going to influence the response to the exposure or treatment, if they're evenly balanced among groups, that neutralizes that effect. So randomization is useful and powerful. Blinding, of course, is a direct defense against ascertainment bias and intervention bias. And placebo control, as everybody knows, is a way of differentiating specific from non-specific effects. That's what it's for, right? So a placebo may do some good, but it shouldn't do nearly as much good as a genuinely effective treatment. It's actually the difference between the non-specific placebo effect and the treatment-specific effect of whatever your intervention is that you're looking for. So value in each of these things, but it doesn't produce a perfect tool. There are limitations to randomized controlled trials in predicting effectiveness. What they tend to predict is efficacy. Efficacy is in the context of a clinical trial. Effectiveness is a real-world issue. RCTs aren't always the answer because sometimes you can't use them at all. It may be unethical, obviously, so there are times you can't use them. And they all tend to produce biased results because you're only ever enrolling people willing to participate in a randomized trial. And so often you're gaining internal validity. The answer is true for the specific population that participated at the expense of external validity. The people who participated don't look like anybody in the real world. So there's a trade-off there. So a number of important limitations. And of course, sometimes you simply can't randomize. And in our area, we're talking about nutrition. You can't blind people to what they're eating. certainly not for an extended period of time. You could maybe blind them to tasting one food, blindfold them, hold their noses, and have them eat A or B, but not to a diet. You can't keep people blinded to their diet. And what is a placebo diet? Where would we even start? Right? So we have to acknowledge, we, the nutrition community, wait a minute, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, okay, we can randomize, but we can't blind. There is no placebo. So we've immediate got problems. And then in addition to that, what we're typically interested in is a very complex variable. We're interested in the effects of the overall dietary pattern. But that's shifting in all kinds of ways. If we want to add more of food A and keep the calories the same, the energy the same, we're going to probably need to have less of food B. Well, we just introduced two variables, not one. Everything we do to influence the composition of a diet is like tossing a pebble in a pond. It will ripple all the way through. So we'll have multiple changes. We have to embrace the fact that this is a much more complex variable than RCTs are really designed to study. And by the way, the signature value of randomized controlled trials is attribution. Two groups with exposures that differ in only one carefully controlled way. So if there's a change in outcomes, you can attribute the outcome to the difference in the exposure. In the case of diet, it's multiple exposures. It's the overall dietary pattern. We have to somehow agree that that very complex composite variable is the variable we care about. And then, of course, the other thing we care about is long-term effects, and RCTs are not great for very long-term studies. But I would say the most important limitation of an RCT is that the answer is never better than the question, and the question can be manipulated. So here's an example of a study. This was in 2020. Looking at the health effects of plant-based meat relative to actual meat, to beef. And the lead investigator here is my friend at Stanford, Christopher Gardner, whose name is likely known to many of you. And Christopher called this study swap meat because they were swapping out actual meat for plant-based meat. And this was important and timely because up to this time, when we talked about plant-based meat, there were two things we knew. We knew it was better for the planet, and we knew it was kinder and gentler to our fellow creatures that didn't need to be slaughtered for us to have a meal. But we really didn't know if these highly processed products were better for human health. That's what this trial was about. It looked at a whole array of metabolic markers, including TMAO. And the conclusion was, yes, if you take beef hamburgers out of the diet and put plant-based meat beyond burgers in, you wind up with improvement in the cardiometabolic profile. And it was pretty definitive. But then 5 years later, we get this trial, pretty much the same thing. Daily consumption of beef compared to plant-based meat, no effect on metabolic markers at all. So two randomized trials showing exactly the opposite thing. And of course, we get this all the time. Well, how did this happen? Well, all we really know from the title is that they studied the same thing, asked the same question, but they don't tell us the details of how they went about answering it because the RCT doesn't require them to do that the same way. So in the case of the Gardner study, the swap meat study, they used fairly standard beef, although high quality, and they used a critical dose of it, so about the amount of beef that people would actually eat every day, and swap that out of the diet. All you needed to do to reverse the results was use a whole lot less beef and make the beef really special. So here the beef was the highest quality they could find, extremely low in saturated fat. So it was extra lean beef. It was a very small serving. That was substituted with plant-based meat at that very low serving. And by the way, this study concluded there was no difference. For those of you who are aficionados of biostatistical methods, there actually is a trial designed to prove equivalence. And the sample is called an active control equivalence study, an ACEs study. And the sample size for proving equivalence is much bigger than the sample size just to fail to find a difference. All this study did was fail to find a difference, which simply means it's underpowered. Proving that with 95% confidence there isn't a difference is a completely different threshold that this study didn't meet. But as you could well imagine, the media picks this up and says, one study says yes, one study says no, so no two nutrition experts agree and we're confused again. But the devilry was in the details here. Christopher set out to answer the question honestly. This group had ties to the beef industry and wanted to show that plant-based meat wasn't better. And so that's what it looked like they did show. My point then is that RCTs are powerful, but they can be manipulated. They can be distorted. They cannot compensate for the quality of the question, nor do they guarantee you integrity. They don't guarantee that the two things you're comparing are on a level playing field, that you really tried to make a fair match. They don't guarantee that you're looking at a critical dose. So powerful tools, yes, but a hammer is a bad screwdriver, right? There's no one tool to do every job, and we need to be looking past that and thinking about an array of tools. Continuing with this answer, Ronnie, about getting past the tyranny of RCTs, we've all been told that correlation is not causation. I'm sure you've all heard that, and I'm going to disagree. I would say that often correlation actually is causation. I imagine many of you are parents, and I would guess that all of my fellow parents in the group or grandparents endorse the concept that kids should not run with scissors. But I challenge you to show me the randomized controlled trial from which that wisdom derives. I trust we all know that if we put our hand in a fire, we're going to get burned. How do we know that? Did anyone ever read a meta-analysis on that topic? And I bet all of you are as confident as I am that if you toss an apple up in the air, it will come back down to you just like it did for Sir Isaac. So we have no randomized controlled trials, no systematic reviews, no meta-analyses on any of these topics, nor do we have any systematic reviews or meta-analyses or randomized controlled trials telling us that it is indeed a good idea to look both ways before crossing a busy street. How do we know these things? Correlation, right? Observation and the consistency of that observation. Every apple ever thrown up in Earth's atmosphere comes back down. When kids run with sharp objects, they often fall and get hurt. We've seen these things enough times with sufficient consistency that we can absolutely assert cause and effect. Putting a hand in a fire will result in a burn. We don't need a randomized controlled trial. We don't need a placebo fire to know that. So that the notion that randomized controlled trials are the arbiters of truth has run amok. And it's dangerous because then all you need to do to say, I am the sacred guardian of truth, is do a randomized controlled trial. And a randomized controlled trial can be distorted. It can be manipulated. It can be designed to answer a bad question. It can be designed to answer an unfair question. But if we all endorse the concept that that is the sole repository of sacred truth, as soon as there's an RCT opposing us, how do we oppose it? We've just said that's the best way to get at truth. I disagree. And many others disagree too. I recommend a couple of books to you. The first is the book of Why, The New Science of Cause and Effect. Judea Pearl is considered one of the founding fathers of artificial intelligence. And in designing artificial intelligence, they rely very much on the fact that correlation is causation. In particular, artificial intelligence is built around the concept of counterfactuals. The idea that if not for A, B would not have occurred. Can we imagine a scenario where B happened even though A did not? So we think about my very simple example, getting burned because you put your hand in a fire. If you didn't put your hand near the fire, would you have had the burn? And if the answer is no, if we can't come up with an alternative explanation for that outcome, then basically that correlation is used to underlie our understanding of causation, because counterfactuals don't account for its occurrence any other way. Artificial intelligence is built around that concept. One other book I would recommend, I'm halfway through this one currently, it was recommended to me by a colleague who's an expert in statistics, is Bernoulli's fallacy. It's the failure to use in our statistical methods prior probability. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. I suspect many of you are familiar with Bayes' theorem and the idea that there's some baseline level of probability. So for example, if you have a patient who has distended belly and sore breasts and is nauseated only in the mornings, and the patient is 23 years old and sexually active, what do you think is going on? Well, sounds a lot like that could be pregnancy, until I tell you the patient is a man. And now you know the prior probability of pregnancy is 0, and whatever's going on has to be something else because men don't get pregnant, right? So the prior probability is a very, very potent concept. It's systematically ignored in the statistics we get in medical journals. So we get the same p-value, whether the hypothesis being tested is aligned with a massive evidence and is highly probable to be correct, or whether the hypothesis being tested is a radical departure from everything we thought we knew and is very unlikely to be correct. There's no adjustment in our statistics. That's probably a fundamental flaw. That's what this book by a mathematician is all about. Very interesting stuff. So I would argue that we have to superimpose sense to use science well. And I've long contended science is the most powerful means humanity's ever devised to get at hard to reach truths. It drives forward with the force of a freight train, but sense must lay the tracks, because if you've got the train and you don't have a good set of tracks, you wind up with a train wreck. And I think very often in science, we look on as this happens and we have to defend against it. You asked about the hierarchy of evidence and so just one final response there. So some years ago, I oversaw a project called HELM, Hierarchies of Evidence Applied to Lifestyle Medicine. And the idea was that in lifestyle medicine, where we care about years in life and life in years, we really can't get at those answers with RCTs. We're not going to randomize people to different lifestyles or different diets, even for 50 years or 80 years or 100 years, and see what their differential outcomes are. So if we're not always going to be able to get the information we need from RCTs, where do we get the information? And in particular, we're seeing use of a grading system called GRADE, which prioritizes randomized controlled trials to tell us that the evidence is of a high quality. So yeah, but that's only helpful when you can get the answers using randomized controlled trials. A lot of this methodology comes from pharmacoepidemiology, where you're studying drugs, and it's easy to do RCTs. It's not so easy in the lifestyle space. So I think what we need to do is recognize hybrid vigor as we synthesize evidence and say, we actually don't just want RCTs. RCTs are very useful in a particular way. They help us with attribution, but we want long-term effects. We want effects in large populations. So what we did a methodologic systematic review of strength of evidence tools. We did a review of risk of bias tools, and we identified gaps in the literature. And we came up with a method called evidence threshold pathway mapping. And the idea is you want to clear a certain bar. You want to have a certain level of evidence, a threshold of evidence, informing your confidence that something is true or not true. But the way you get there and get over the bar can involve a variety of evidence sources. And we said there are at least 3 distinct sources of evidence that contribute to our understanding of what's true. They're basic mechanistic studies which tell us whether or not something could work, and if so, how. There are intervention studies like RCTs that are very useful for attribution. We know we got Y because of X. And then there are observational studies which typically give us scale and duration. And the strength of evidence is the aggregated score across all 3. So we spelled this out in tables in the paper. The paper is available to you. I provided the citation in the slide deck. One of you certainly can, I'll give you my slides. You can share them with everybody after this. But again, those same basic methods. We then said that achieving that threshold of evidence is about aggregating across this expanse. And these are eye charts. I apologize, this one in particular. But all I'm showing here is we created a quantitative means of putting these together. And then there was a numerical score to say how strong the evidence was. So imagine if you had a lot of mechanistic studies showing that A causes B. And then you have some, maybe not very many, but you have some short-term randomized controlled trials looking at surrogate markers, biomarkers, for example, suggesting attribution in people. And then some large-scale observational epidemiology, prospective cohort studies, retrospective cohort studies, and so forth. Maybe ethnography, like the blue zones, where you're looking at whole populations over lifetimes and generations. If those various forms of evidence line up, how many RCTs do you need to be completely convinced that you understand what's going on? So that's what we talked about, different ways of aggregating evidence to achieve the same level of confidence. So HELM is an evidence synthesis method specifically designed for lifestyle medicine. And it's all about the hierarchies of evidence and the fact that RCTs are a contributor, but they really don't drive the whole show here. A few other considerations quickly. First, the wrong question leads to confusion no matter how erudite the answer. Which is better, low fat or low carb, for example? Silly question, because you could have a good or bad low fat diet or a good or bad low carb diet. And good diets do better than bad diets. We've seen that studied. There was another study by Christopher Gardner called Diet Fits that compared high quality low fat to high quality low carb, and even looked at genetic markers and found absolutely no difference, because what really mattered was the diet quality, not the macronutrient threshold. There's no remedy for a bad question. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? So the failure to find a thing does not prove it's not there. That's that RCT I showed you that claimed to show equivalence between meat and plant-based meat may simply have been underpowered. Science is not dogma and vice versa. In other words, we're never entirely sure just because there's an RCT that says something is true. And with RCTs and other forms of evidence, you can go cherry picking, which means you only look for the studies that give you the answer you wanted and systematically ignore the rest. That's what most fad diet books that sound very impressive do. They have a lot of citations, but they're all on one side of the ledger. They systematically ignore the countervailing evidence. We have to be sensitive to that, even if the general public is not. I'm also really concerned about false equivalence. Again, if we have an RCT that shows something very controversial, eating more meat is good, eating more meat is harmless, eating more protein is good, whatever it might say, we have so exalted the RCT that sets us up for false equivalence. So the media will announce to the public, new study shows everything you thought you knew until yesterday was wrong. Well, wait a minute. Everything we thought we knew till yesterday is thousands of RCTs. How is it that this one RCT, yes, okay, RCTs are exalted, but this is one study versus thousands of studies. How are we throwing out everything we thought we knew until yesterday? We do that over and over and over again. So we both need to, A, highlight the limitations of RCTs, and B, we need very consistently to be champions of the weight of high quality evidence. And no one study replaces the accumulated weight of evidence. Yes, every now and then we're fundamentally wrong, and we have a scientific revolution and a brand new paradigm, to borrow from Thomas Kuhn, but that's very rare. By and large, no one study refutes everything we thought we knew. And then the other thing that concerns me, this actually will anticipate our discussion of the Dietary Guidelines, Roni, is I think we have a distorted view of conflicts of interest, and that term gets thrown around, and we have made that term a weapon that internet trolls can use against us. Because let's say you are an expert in plant-based diets, and the reason you're an expert in plant-based diets is you're an expert in nutrition who's followed the evidence where it leads and decided what's true based on the evidence, and then decided you wanted to do things to support what you now know to be true. And so when the plant-based meat companies go looking for an expert consultant to do research, you say, I'm willing to do that because that's of interest to me. That's a confluent interest, not a conflict. A conflict is when you say something you don't really believe is true because someone's paying you. A confluence is when you've already been saying it because you believe it's true, and then you do expert work in that area. So what we see is that there's a distortion between the two, and I think we should differentiate between conflicts and confluences. Conflicts cause people to say things and represent point of views they probably don't believe are true. Confluences are when you put your money where your mouth is, you walk the walk as well as talking the talk, you actually do the work in the area where you have expertise, and you have that expertise because you followed the evidence where it led you. So I published this in the American Journal of Health Promotion, that we need to make this distinction. So I've heard people say that Walter Willett has conflicts of interest when he talks about the planetary health diet because he's written books, and he'll sell more books if people believe in his point of view. And I heard that Christopher Gardner had a conflict of interest for doing that study of plant-based meat because he's interested in promoting plant-based diets. And for that matter, when Al Gore invested in green economy companies after an inconvenient truth, after winning an Academy Award for his efforts to advance our understanding of what we were doing to the planet. His political opposition accused him of a conflict of interest. He's talking about these companies because he's going to make money if they do well. No, he was talking about these companies first and then invested in them. That's a confluence of interest. The point of view came first, it's real expertise. The investment of time, effort, money, blood, sweat, tears came after. If we don't differentiate, I can guarantee you the internet trolls never will. And they use this against us all the time to say we're all conflicted. And that's actually part of what contaminated the dietary guidelines. And I will pause there again, Ronnie, so we can move on to another question.
Okay, so that's exactly the next question. Lastly, we'll address the topic that has been on everyone's mind in the last couple of weeks, the new dietary guidelines for Americans. So I want to ask you, what is your perspective on this major reset of federal nutrition policy? Specifically, how well do you feel they reflect the current evidence on human health? And how concerned are you about the continued omission of planetary health and sustainability?
So good, really good questions all. So I'm deeply concerned. Again, I'll share my slides with you, Ronnie. You can distribute them to everybody, and then there'll be links to these various things I've written. So I write a blog, and I vent my various passions there. And I've written a couple times about the dietary guidelines. And this would be the takeaway message. There's a little bit of baby and a whole lot of sullied bathwater. And one of the things that made this so challenging is the fact that there is a little bit of baby. In other words, there's some things that are good in the dietary guidelines. They do inveigh against they call it hyper-processed food. They really should have used the term ultra-processed food to line us up with the NOVA classification and the work of Carlos Montero. But they used hyper-processed probably in a willful effort to be vague, so we didn't know exactly what they meant. They obviously continue to recommend people eat fruits and vegetables. And so they got a few things right, but they got an awful lot wrong. The first thing to note is the process here in the United States. The dietary guidelines are generated in a two-step process. Step one is to convene the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which is a multidisciplinary group of scientists, very carefully selected, very thoroughly vetted. And they basically work in a fishbowl as volunteers for 2 years. And by fishbowl, I mean they're very visible to the public. We know who they are. We know what they're doing. They have a whole sequence of public meetings where you can watch them online. You can comment about what they're doing. So they're very exposed. And they work for 2 years to generate a comprehensive report about what the evidence says. The only bounds on that work is they are told at the very beginning what questions they're not allowed to ask. And one of the questions they were told they are not allowed to ask is sustainability. They were not allowed to address that. And I think that's a disgraceful omission, but it has nothing to do with the quality of the scientists or the science. It has everything to do with the marching orders they received at the start of all this. After this group is done, working for 2 years, they generate a report called the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee Report. And that, by the way, is published. It's online. So if you Google Dietary Guidelines for Americans, you don't just find the dietary guidelines, you also find the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee Report. The actual dietary guidelines, that's step two, are the result of what the Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, two government agencies directly accountable to the administration, tell the public they're supposed to do, supposedly based on the science, but not necessarily. In other words, the dietary guidelines and the dietary guidelines science are two completely separate steps. And they've always parted ways, but they've never parted ways quite as radically as they did this time around. The fundamental truth about eating well, and you know, I could argue we really don't need new dietary guidelines every 5 years because this message has not changed and it's not going to. By the way, we've had formal dietary guidelines in the US since 1980, so 45 years, every 5 years. And this was true at the beginning, it's true now, it'll be true 45 years from now. Michael Pollan's famous aphorism, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And by the way, if you eat real food, minimally processed, mostly plants. The not too much tends to take care of itself, because among the many virtues of wholesome foods and a sensible assembly is they fill you up on fewer calories. But this is a fundamental truth. It's a fundamental truth to which I've devoted much of my career. I've written review papers on this. This was commissioned years ago by Annual Reviews. Can we say what diet is best for health? It took me 5,000 words, but I reached the same conclusion Michael Pollan reached in 7 words. And then I've overseen 4 editions now of a nutrition textbook for health professionals. The most recent in 2022, the 4th edition, is 850 pages. I think we've got 20 or 30,000 citations in the text. Real view from altitude, every topic under the sun. Same conclusion: we should eat real food, mostly plants. So I think we really should stop pretending like that's in any way controversial and say that is established fact. And the dietary guidelines people need are superimposed on top of that. So given that, what should people eat more of? What should people eat less of? The guidelines we get are pretty useless because they start all over from scratch every time. They systematically ignore environmental impact. So, honey, I think this is a devastating omission. I would argue that the signature threat to health in our time is disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, because that reverberates across public health, planetary health, the nature of government, whether it's a democracy or not, politics, geopolitics, everything. But in terms of adverse effects, the single greatest threat to us all is what we're doing to the planet. If I had to pick one patient that matters more than any other, it's the planet. So our diets that are bad for us are also cooking the planet. There are lots of papers on this topic that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee could have looked at if they were allowed to, but they weren't allowed to. This is one of my favorites from a group at Oxford. Marco Springman and others were involved with the Eat Lancet report, multiple health and environmental impacts of food. So they generate charts like this one. Across the top, you see human health outcomes: mortality, coronary disease, colorectal cancer, diabetes, stroke. Along the side, you see a list of foods, and then you see their effect on these outcomes. Green is good, red is bad, other colors are intermediate. And in B, you see planetary health outcomes: acidification, eutrophication, or the use of nitrogen, greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use. Along the side, the same list of foods and the same color scheme. Green is a beneficial effect, red is an adverse effect, other colors are intermediate. If we sum this up, you get a chart that looks like this: human mortality on the x-axis, adverse planetary health effects on the y-axis. The best place to be is the bottom left, where you're not killing people or harming the planet. And look what's there: the usual suspects: vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds. And the upper right is the Badlands. That's where you're killing people and hurting the planet. And we have both unprocessed and processed meat up there. The dietary guidelines were completely inattentive to this critical consideration. Frankly, I think it's a disgrace. And again, plant-based diets are clearly beneficial to human health. That's very well established. But the net benefit for planetary health is even greater. And the dietary guidelines we got not only ignored this, but diametrically opposed it. So the dietary guidelines, yes, they advise people not to eat hyper-processed food. Yes, they still include fruits and vegetables, obviously. They somewhat begrudgingly include whole grains and legumes. But look at this inverted pyramid that came along with the guidelines. That upper left corner, it's all animal food. That's where the protein goes. I don't see beans. I don't see lentils up there. And not only do I see beef, I see beef twice. There's a big steak and there's hamburger meat. So twice over. So this is what people are going to take away. And yes, fruits and vegetables are there. Whole grains are way down at the bottom. There were a number of other important distortions. The guidelines have often been political, have often been somewhat ideological. They've never been internally inconsistent and overtly wrong before, indicating that the people who wrote the guidelines actually have very limited nutrition knowledge. They recommend olive oil as a good source of essential fatty acids. I imagine everybody here knows that olive oil, it's an excellent oil, and there are health benefits of oleic acid. There are also health benefits, we're talking about extra virgin olive oil, of some of the other compounds in olive oil, like oleocanthal, one of the bioflavonoids. So I love extra virgin olive oil. It's good stuff, but not because it's a source of essential fatty acids. Low levels of omega-6 in olive oil and negligible, trivial levels of omega-3. Not only do they say olive oil is a good source of essential fatty acids, they call it a co-equally good source as butter and beef tallow, neither of which is a source of essential fatty acids. So all of the sources of healthy fat that they tell us are co-equal are nothing alike with regard to their fatty acid distribution. And they point us in a direction to source our essential omega-3s and omega-6s where we're actually not getting them. All three sources they indicate are absolutely trivial sources of omega-3, which is really the rate limiting. Alpha-linolenic acid is really the rate limiting essential fatty acid in modern diets. So they're completely wrong there. In another area where they're wrong, they preserved a recommendation to limit our intake of saturated fat, but expressly advised that everyone consume 3 servings a day of full fat dairy, plus increase their protein by eating more meat. And if a person with an average adult diet follows those food-based recommendations, there's absolutely no way to abide by the saturated fat limitation. In other words, the nutrient level recommendations and the food level recommendations do not go together at all. Yet a third area where they made a factual error, they're listing non-nutritive sweeteners as sugar substitutes. They're mostly advising against them. They rattle off a list of those, and included on that list is xylitol. Xylitol is not a non-nutritive sweetener. It's not an artificial sweetener. It's a naturally occurring sugar alcohol. It's present at low levels in many fruits. So again, there's demonstrated in these guidelines, as I've never seen it before, an overt lack of nutrition knowledge. You would expect the dietary guidelines to be written by people who at least knew what they were doing. So they are political, they are ideological, they directly oppose the recommendations of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report in a couple of areas. To be clear, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee specifically recommended a reduction in the consumption of beef and other meat for the benefit of human health, let alone planetary health. And they looked very carefully at the evidence on protein and reached the conclusion that there was no evidence to recommend that the general public increase our intake of protein. The dietary guidelines expressly recommend that we increase our protein and expressly recommend that we eat meat throughout the day as the primary protein source. So not just ignoring the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee science, but diametrically opposing it. I haven't really seen that before. So this takes the politicization of dietary guidance to an entirely new level. I could keep going, but that's the gist. So at the end of it all, is there a baby? Yeah, but it's a very little baby. So yes, they advise against hyper-processed food. Yes, they still encourage that we eat fruits and vegetables, but there's a lot of sullied bathwater here. And I suspect the ideology prevailed over epidemiology. There was an agenda here. And the only agenda for dietary guidelines at the level of a whole population should be promoting the health of the population. That clearly was not the case. There were ties here to the beef and dairy industries, and those were well represented. All right, Ronnie, I'll leave it there.
Okay, so thank you. I have a last question. Maybe you started answering it a bit, but I guess you have some more messages to give. To wrap things up for our audience of health professionals, what are the key fundamental messages you would like us to carry forward regarding a healthy diet?
Well, first of all, I look at diet through at least 3 lenses, and I recently had a colleague tell me I should certainly append a 4th. So I ask, as a physician, what are the direct human health effects? That's been my job. But second, I don't think you can be a health professional in 2026 and not advocate passionately and fiercely for the health of the planet for reasons already discussed. We have some hope of being healthy, vital people on a healthy, vital planet, or we have no hope of being healthy, vital people. So I look at planetary health effects. I think that's my job too. And I care about cruelty to our fellow creatures. I don't want wanton cruelty on my menu. I don't think any decent person does. So what are the implications of how we eat for how we treat our fellow creatures? The 4th lens would be a social equity lens. What about the production of food a particular way? How is it treating the workers responsible for generating food, the supply side of all of this? So that would be the fourth lens. I look through those three lenses, and the fundamental answer is the same. Eat food, mostly plants. A diet that's good for human health is mostly made up of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds in some balanced combination. You don't have to have all of those, and you don't have to have every entry in each of those categories. If you're gluten intolerant, you're not going to have every whole grain, for instance. And some people might avoid grains entirely, and you could still put together a wholesome diet, but mostly made up of those groups, with or without the addition of anything else you might want to eat. So some meat, okay, some poultry, okay, some fish, okay, some dairy, okay, eggs, okay. As long as your diet, whatever you do with all those other choices, is mostly vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, and plain water when thirsty. So I would say the single most important message for those of us in the nutrition community is to acknowledge that our understanding of that fundamental truth for the sake of people, planet, fellow creatures, and, by the way, democratizing food on the production side, so social equity too, our understanding of that is unshakable, in the same way that our understanding that if you put your hand in a fire, it's going to get burned is unshakable. No new RCT is going to change that. We know that answers can be manipulated by asking bad questions. We know that RCTs can be designed to produce a biased outcome. And the evidence that we value most represents an aggregation across mechanistic studies, randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses, large-scale observational studies spanning decades, and ethnography like the blue zones. The blue zones, those 5 populations characterized by Dan Buettner, are very heterogeneous, but they all eat real food, mostly plants. Their diets are quite different. The diet in Okinawa, Japan is a very low-fat diet. The diet in Ikaria, Greece, and Sardinia, Italy is a high-fat Mediterranean diet. They're quite different, but they're real food, mostly plants. The diet on the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica is omnivorous. The diet in Loma Linda, California is mostly plant-based, vegetarian, and often vegan. But that's not the critical consideration. There are variations on a common theme. The critical consideration is the common theme. So I think one of the things we need to do is telescope to the world. When we think about a high-quality diet, what are the outcomes we're considering? And again, as a health professional, I feel equally obligated to advocate for the health of the planet as for a patient. I think that is my job. I submit to all of my colleagues, it's all of our collective job. And to acknowledge to the world that we value the RCT the same way we would value one tool in a shop designed to make something like a car. It's a great tool. It's just one tool. We work with a wide variety of tools. And the truth and understanding we're seeking to construct, a fundamental, reliable, solid understanding that stands the test of time, is put together with a wide variety of tools. I don't want to be bullied and told, you don't know anything in nutrition because you haven't done enough randomized controlled trials. And we hear that all the time, and it's false. It is absolutely false. We have plenty of RCTs, but we also should do a better job of defending the fact that that's not our only tool. We don't rely exclusively on RCTs. Sometimes they get us the answers we want, sometimes they don't. We're looking at a variety of sources of evidence using a variety of methods, just like you need a wide variety of tools to do a complex job. Our complex job is to understand what's fundamentally true about health promoting human nutrition, and we do. And it doesn't change every year, and it doesn't change every 5 years, and it's not going to change. We will add a great deal of detail. We will learn new things. And some of what we thought we knew will prove to be wrong. But the fundamentals of health promoting nutrition for people and planet is not going to be news. In the blue zones, nobody is waiting to watch Good Morning America or the Today Show to know what diet is good this week. They eat the way they have eaten for a lifetime, the way their parents ate, the way their grandparents ate, the way they've eaten for generations. Good nutrition does not always need to be news. That's the news.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. So let's take some questions from the audience.